The envelope was thin, almost fragile, the kind that could easily be mistaken for trash if someone wasn't paying attention. It rested beneath the edge of the ceramic plate, partly hidden, as if it didn't want to be found too quickly. No name written on the outside, no urgency in its placement, just there, waiting. Maya Collins almost cleared it away with the rest of the table. Her movements were automatic, guided by routine rather than thought. The late morning lull at the diner always felt heavier than the rush hours. Not because it was busy, but because it gave her mind room to wander. And wandering thoughts were dangerous when rent was due in 9 days, and her younger brother had texted that morning asking if she could help with his tuition deposit again. She stacked the plates, wiped the surface in slow circles, and only then noticed the envelope. It wasn't sealed. That was the first thing that made her pause. Inside was a single folded page, no handwriting on the outside, just paper, plain and unassuming. She hesitated, glancing toward the counter, then back at the empty booth by the window. The man who had been sitting there had already left. She unfolded the paper. The message was short, careful, almost restrained. Some people hide not because they are afraid of being seen, but because being known would force them to change. Maya read it twice. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. Her expression stayed neutral, but something subtle shifted in her chest, a pressure she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't curiosity exactly, it was recognition, as if the sentence had brushed against a thought she'd never allowed herself to articulate. She folded the paper again and slipped it into the pocket of her apron, telling herself she would throw it away later. She didn't. Maya Collins was 27 years old, and life had already taught her how unreliable comfort could be. She worked as a server at a roadside diner just outside of Madison, Wisconsin, a place locals visited out of habit rather than affection. The coffee was always a little too bitter, the stools slightly uneven, the conversations familiar enough to be ignored. But the job paid just enough, and for now, enough was all she could afford to want. Her days followed predictable patterns. Morning shift, afternoon classes at the community college, evenings spent studying accounting textbooks she didn't love but tolerated because practicality mattered more than passion. There was no room for indulgence, no space for risk. People like Maya didn't believe in coincidence. So when the man returned the next morning and sat in the same booth by the window, she noticed. He looked ordinary in the most deliberate way. Early 40s, perhaps 41 or 42. Neutral clothing, clean but worn. The kind of presence that blended rather than announced itself. He ordered oatmeal and black coffee, thanked her quietly, and spent most of the time looking out the window as snow dusted the sidewalk. They exchanged no more than 3 sentences. And yet, when he left, Maya found herself checking the table again. There was no envelope this time. Daniel Hart had mastered restraint long before he learned ambition. At 42, his name appeared on regional business journals and internal reports that shaped transportation contracts and municipal funding decisions. As managing director of a logistics consultancy that advised state infrastructure projects, Daniel had influence without spectacle, power that moved quietly through spreadsheets, negotiations, and closed-door meetings. He had learned early that visibility was optional, control was not. But here, in this diner, he was no one of consequence. And that was precisely why he kept coming back. The place grounded him in a way his glass office never could. No assistants, no meetings, no expectations beyond paying the bill and not overstaying his welcome. He could exist without performance. And then there was Maya. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't fill silence for comfort. She moved with an efficiency that suggested discipline rather than enthusiasm. He noticed the faint tension in her shoulders, the way she exhaled slowly when she thought no one was watching. The signs of someone who carried responsibility without recognition. Daniel didn't intend to leave the note, but something about her, about the quiet way she endured, made him feel exposed in his anonymity, as if hiding in plain sight wasn't enough, as if some part of him wanted to be acknowledged, even anonymously. So he wrote, and walked away before he could reconsider. The days that followed were unremarkable in all the ways that mattered. Maya told herself the note was nothing. A random act from a stranger, a sentence meant to sound profound, but ultimately empty. And yet, it lingered. It surfaced at inconvenient moments. While she waited for the bus, while she balanced her bank app against her grocery list, while she lay awake, listening to the radiator knock through the walls of her apartment. She wondered why someone would leave words like that behind, and what kind of person would need to. A week later, Daniel returned again. Same booth, same order. This time he stayed longer. Their conversation remained minimal. Polite, functional, but familiarity settled between them, subtle and unspoken. He became part of her routine, and she became part of his. She learned small things about him, that he was between contracts, that he did freelance consulting, that he rented a modest place near the industrial district. None of it was false, just selectively incomplete. He learned she was studying accounting, that she helped support her brother, that she worked more hours than she admitted. They never spoke about the note, and yet it hovered between them, unacknowledged but present. If you've ever found yourself drawn into a story, not because of dramatic moments, but because of the quiet spaces between them, this might be a good moment to stay connected. Subscribing isn't about obligation. It's about choosing to follow stories that unfold slowly, honestly, and without noise. What Maya didn't know was that Daniel's firm had recently been contracted to evaluate a major freight rerouting project. The proposed changes would redirect heavy truck traffic directly through older residential zones. Areas where rent was lower, voices were quieter, and resistance was easier to manage. The project was framed as efficiency, optimization, progress. But progress always had a cost, and it was never paid by those who designed it. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a notice taped to the diner's front door. A city bulletin announcing upcoming zoning reviews and potential infrastructure adjustments. The owner cursed under his breath. Customers murmured. Someone joked about construction delays. Maya felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. That night, she mentioned it casually to Daniel. Not accusingly, just tired. He listened more intently than she expected, and for the first time in years, the distance between his professional decisions and their human consequences collapsed into something uncomfortably close. The tension didn't explode. It accumulated. Maya began to notice inconsistencies. The way Daniel avoided specifics about his work, the way he paused before answering certain questions, the way his phone buzzed during city council news segments, and he silenced it without checking. She wasn't suspicious by nature, but she was observant. One evening, after closing, she followed an instinct she had learned not to ignore. She searched his name. Nothing. No digital footprint. No freelance listings. No professional presence. Absence, she knew, could be louder than evidence. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It revealed itself in fragments, public records, meeting minutes, consulting disclosures buried deep in municipal PDFs, and finally, a photo attached to an article about transportation reform. Daniel Hart. Not the man from the diner, but someone adjacent enough to make her chest tighten. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She needed to understand what she was dealing with first. Maya didn't sleep well that night. Not because she was afraid, but because her mind refused to stay still. It kept rearranging details, replaying moments she had previously dismissed as insignificant. The way Daniel listened too carefully when she mentioned the zoning notice. The way he never complained about money, even when claiming instability. The way his posture changed subtly whenever conversations drifted toward politics or city decisions, as if a different version of him momentarily surfaced before retreating again. She wasn't angry yet. Anger required certainty. What she felt instead was something colder and more disciplined. Awareness. Over the next few days, she paid attention with intention. Not openly, not confrontationally, just enough to confirm that her instincts hadn't betrayed her. She noticed how Daniel's schedule aligned too neatly with city meetings, how his phone calls always ended with controlled phrases and neutral tones, how he avoided being seen near the diner during peak hours whenever public discussions about infrastructure projects appeared on the local news. Maya had grown up watching adults make careful choices to survive. Her mother had learned when to speak and when silence was safer. Her father, before leaving, had mastered the art of promising without delivering. Observation had been her education long before accounting classes ever were. And Daniel, for all his restraint, was leaving patterns behind. Daniel felt the shift before he understood it. There was a subtle distance now, a recalibration in the way Maya interacted with him. She was still polite, still professional. But something essential had withdrawn. The warmth that had never been explicit but always present had cooled into something observational, almost analytical. He recognized that tone. It was the same one junior analysts used when they had discovered an inconsistency but weren't yet sure how to frame it. Daniel told himself he was imagining things. He had lived his life managing information asymmetry, deciding who needed to know what and when. This situation was no different, he reasoned. He hadn't lied, not technically. He had simply curated. But curation, he was beginning to realize, came with its own kind of dishonesty. The freight rerouting proposal moved forward faster than anticipated. Community notices became formal announcements. Flyers appeared on utility poles. Local meetings filled with concerned residents who spoke with the urgency of people used to being ignored. Maya attended 2 of them, sitting quietly near the back, absorbing the tension in the room. She listened as older residents worried about air quality, as parents asked about safety near schools, as small business owners feared declining foot traffic. No one mentioned Daniel. No one knew his name, but his work echoed through every concern. Maya started helping where she could. She offered to organize notes, track deadlines, explain documents in simpler terms. Accounting wasn't activism, but numbers could still tell stories that were harder to dismiss when written clearly. She didn't tell Daniel about the meetings, not yet. If you're still following this story, you might already recognize something familiar here. The moment when personal comfort collides with moral clarity. Stories like this don't offer easy heroes or villains, only choices. If you want to keep exploring narratives that live in that grey space, staying subscribed keeps that door open. Daniel's internal conflict sharpened into something unavoidable. At work, he pushed back on assumptions he had previously accepted without question. He asked for revised impact assessments, requested additional community consultations. His colleagues noticed. Some admired the caution. Others warned him quietly about delays, optics, and investor confidence. He justified his actions professionally, but privately he knew the truth. He was seeing faces now, hearing voices. The diner was no longer just a neutral space, it had become a reference point, a reminder that the outcomes of his work extended beyond reports. And Maya was at the center of that realization. He considered telling her, many times. But every version of the confession ended the same way. With the certainty that once spoken, nothing between them would remain untouched. The anonymity that had allowed honesty would dissolve, replaced by a power imbalance he could no longer pretend didn't exist. So he waited, and waiting, he would soon learn, was a choice in itself. Maya didn't confront him directly, because she needed to understand her own position first. She wasn't naive. She knew relationships were rarely clean. People carried histories, responsibilities, compromises. But there was a difference between complexity and concealment, and Daniel had crossed that line. The question wasn't whether she cared about him. She did. The question was whether caring justified silence. The answer, slowly and painfully, became clear. The confrontation didn't happen at the diner. It happened on a gray afternoon outside the municipal building, where a public forum had just ended in frustration and raised voices. Maya stepped outside, papers clutched to her chest, heart racing, not from fear, but from resolve. Daniel was there, not in a suit, not officially, just standing near the steps, observing. Their eyes met, and in that instant, everything unspoken aligned. She approached him calmly. "I know," she said. Just 2 words. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't deny it. He simply closed his eyes briefly, as if acknowledging the weight of a truth that could no longer be deferred. "I never wanted you to find out like this," he replied. Maya nodded once. "There wasn't a way you wanted," she said. "Only a way you avoided." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. It was honest. They didn't argue. They talked. Quietly, carefully. Each sentence chosen with precision, as if both understood that careless words could cause irreparable damage. Daniel explained his work, his influence, his rationalizations. Maya listened, but she didn't soften. "You don't get to decide when transparency becomes inconvenient," she said. "That's not protection, that's control." The word lingered. Control. Daniel had spent his career mastering it, and in that moment, he saw how easily good intentions could mirror the very harm they claimed to prevent. After that day, distance settled between them, not dramatic, not absolute, but firm. Daniel reduced his presence at the diner. Maya focused on community efforts. Their lives moved forward in parallel, intersecting only in memory and unresolved tension. The project, however, did not. It became contested, delayed, questioned, and Daniel found himself at odds not just with investors, but with the version of himself he could no longer defend. If this part of the story stirred something in you, conflict, recognition, discomfort, that's not accidental. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this grow richer when people bring their own experiences into the conversation. The turning point came quietly. A revised proposal landed on Daniel's desk, one that reduced impact but preserved profitability. A compromise that would satisfy most stakeholders without fundamentally addressing displacement. It would be easy to approve. No one would blame him. Everyone would move on. Daniel stared at the document for a long time, then he closed it and began writing something entirely different. Daniel submitted the alternative proposal just before midnight. Not because deadlines demanded it, but because hesitation had finally become heavier than fear. The document reframed the entire project, rerouted freight paths away from residential zones, mandated environmental buffers, included compensation clauses for affected businesses, and, most controversially, introduced community oversight requirements that limited private discretion. It was, from a corporate perspective, reckless. From a human one, overdue. By morning, his phone was already ringing. The first calls were polite, clarifying questions, requests for justification. By noon, the tone shifted, concern sharpened into warning. Words like exposure, liability, and precedent began to surface with increasing frequency. Daniel listened carefully. He responded calmly, and with each conversation he felt something unfamiliar but undeniable: relief. For the first time in years, he wasn't negotiating outcomes. He was standing inside a decision he believed in. Maya heard about the revised proposal from someone else. A woman from the tenants group burst into the diner mid-afternoon, eyes bright with disbelief, voice unsteady with cautious hope. The city was reconsidering. Major adjustments were being reviewed. Someone inside the consulting chain had pushed back, hard. Maya didn't react immediately. She wiped the counter, refilled a coffee cup, let the information settle slowly, carefully, as if sudden optimism required verification before being trusted. But later, alone in the storage room, she allowed herself to breathe differently. She knew. Daniel's professional unraveling didn't happen all at once. It came in layers. An emergency board meeting. A request for leave framed as concern for his well-being. Subtle exclusion from conversations he had once led. Allies grew distant. Support became conditional. Power, he was reminded, was cooperative only as long as it remained predictable. And he had disrupted the pattern. He expected anger. What he hadn't expected was the quiet disappointment. People didn't shout, they didn't threaten, they expressed regret. As if he had violated an unspoken agreement, one that valued stability over integrity, continuity over conscience. By the end of the week, his position was no longer secure. By the end of the month, it was gone. He didn't tell Maya right away. Not because he wanted to protect her from guilt, but because he needed to understand the loss himself first. Identity had a way of clinging to titles long after they were removed. He woke up expecting emails that never came, reached for authority that no longer answered him. But beneath the disorientation, something steadier began to form. He had chosen, and that mattered. Maya saw him again on a cold evening, standing outside the diner after closing hours. He looked the same, and completely different. No suit, no guarded posture, just a man waiting, uncertain whether he had the right to be there. She unlocked her bike and paused. "You don't have to explain," she said before he could speak. He nodded slowly. "I know." They stood there for a moment, the city humming quietly around them, the weight of shared history suspended between past and possibility. "I lost my job," he said finally. Maya met his gaze. "And?" she asked. He exhaled. "And I don't regret it." That was all. And somehow it was enough. They didn't reconcile instantly. Trust didn't return on command. It rebuilt itself the way it always had for Maya, through consistency, presence, and the absence of manipulation. Daniel didn't offer solutions. He didn't promise outcomes. He showed up when invited. He stayed silent when needed. He listened. And that, she noticed, was new. If you've made it this far into the story, you already understand that transformation isn't dramatic. It's uncomfortable, slow, and often lonely. If stories like this resonate with you, staying connected through a subscription helps ensure more narratives like this continue to find their way here. The city approved the revised plan weeks later. It wasn't perfect. No policy ever was. But families stayed. Businesses adapted. The diner remained open. Small victories, measured not in headlines, but in continuity. Daniel began consulting independently, this time openly. Smaller contracts, less influence, more transparency. It was humbling. Maya finished her semester with quiet determination. She applied for an internship with a local nonprofit focused on financial literacy and housing advocacy. Not because she wanted to save anyone, but because she understood the value of access. Their lives didn't merge. They aligned. The final test came unexpectedly. An investigative article was published, tracing the internal resistance that had altered the project's course. Daniel's name appeared, not as a hero, but as a complicating factor. Someone who had disrupted expected outcomes. The comments were divided. Some praised the integrity, others accused him of betrayal. Daniel read them all, and closed the page. For the first time, public opinion felt irrelevant. Maya found the article later that night. She read it slowly, carefully. And then she folded her laptop shut and walked to the window, watching the lights of the city stretch into the distance. She thought of the envelope, the note, the sentence that had once felt like a riddle. Now, it felt like a warning. Time softened the sharpest edges, but it didn't erase what had happened. It reorganized it. Weeks passed, then months, marked not by dramatic milestones, but by small confirmations that life, once disrupted, could settle into something more honest. The city adjusted. Conversations shifted. The diner continued to open every morning, its windows fogging in the cold. Its rhythm unchanged in ways that suddenly felt meaningful. Maya noticed how people spoke differently now. Not louder, not more confident, just less resigned. As if knowing that resistance had once worked made it easier to imagine it happening again. Daniel remained on the margins of that change. Not excluded, but no longer central. And for the first time he understood the difference. They saw each other sporadically, sometimes at the diner, sometimes at public events that no longer carried the same tension. Their conversations stayed careful, unforced. They spoke about books, about work, about things that existed safely in the present. They avoided rewriting the past, not because it was forbidden, but because it had already done what it needed to do. Trust, Maya had learned, wasn't about full access. It was about consistency, without expectation. Daniel didn't ask for forgiveness, and that mattered more than any apology ever could. One evening, as winter began to loosen its grip on the city, Maya found herself alone in her apartment, sorting through old papers she had been meaning to discard for months. Bills, notes from meetings, half-filled notebooks, evidence of survival more than memory. The envelope fell out unexpectedly, thin, creased, familiar. She hadn't read the note in a long time. She unfolded it slowly. Some people hide not because they are afraid of being seen, but because being known would force them to change. She smiled then, not with irony, not with bitterness, but with clarity. The sentence no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a mirror. Maya realized something important in that quiet moment. The note hadn't been written for her. Not entirely. It had been written by someone standing at the edge of transformation, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Someone who understood the cost of being known, but hadn't yet decided whether it was worth paying. She hadn't been chosen as a witness. She had been chosen as a catalyst, and she had accepted the role without ever being asked. Daniel, meanwhile, was learning how to exist without insulation. Independent consulting paid less, required more explanation, demanded transparency he had once considered inefficient, but it also allowed him to sleep without rehearsing conversations in his head, to answer questions without qualifying his intent. He thought often about how easily he could have walked away from the diner without leaving anything behind, how close he had come to remaining unchanged, and how irreversible that would have been. They met again on a Sunday afternoon at a small park near the river. No reason, no agenda, just two people sharing space without needing to define it. They walked slowly, hands occasionally brushing, not out of urgency but familiarity. The city moved around them, indifferent to their history. At one point, Daniel stopped. "I never thanked you," he said quietly. Maya looked at him. "For what?" "For not letting me stay hidden." She considered that, then shook her head gently. "I didn't do that," she replied. "You chose not to." That distinction mattered. It always had. They didn't promise anything. No future plans, no declarations. What existed between them wasn't a conclusion. It was alignment. Two lives altered by proximity to truth, continuing forward without pretending that change guaranteed simplicity. Love, Maya was learning, wasn't about being saved. It was about being seen without surrendering yourself in the process. If you've followed this story to the end, you already know it isn't really about secrets or power or even romance. It's about the quiet moments where we're offered a choice, to stay comfortable or to stay honest. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing. Not out of habit, but as a way of staying connected to narratives that value depth over noise. And if you feel comfortable, share your thoughts or your own experiences in the comments. Stories grow stronger when they're held by a community that understands them. Thank you for being here.